I'm going to hand over to Danny Lee, who's going to be chairing tonight's discussion, and I hope that you enjoy the evening. Over to you.
Sorry, I realised it's a bit anticlimactic because we're sort of already sitting here talking. We started without anyone's permission. That's all right, though, isn't it? I think it's fine. We've known each other for a while, Mark, but there was something I found out about you only recently. You told me that you had almost been a scientist and you were going to study chemistry and you would have been lost to film. So. And then I suppose there's a corruption process where film comes and kind of puts its grubby paw on your shoulder and drags you in. So why don't we start by talking about that other life, that other road that wasn't taken?
I'm sure I didn't say lost to film exactly.
No, that's my interpretation.
Yeah, that's true. You know, and when I was at school, there were the people who were good at words. All the literary people, I wasn't good at words, but I was good at both images and sciencey stuff. So I could look at a Paul Cézanne painting and love it, or an Orson Welles film and love it, or a chemical equation and love it. So it seemed there was no distinction there for me, and that was the road not taken in a way. And I did like at A level. I did maths, physics, chemistry, maths, physics, chemistry, further maths, and art. And that little arty bit on the small finger that suddenly took over and became my life.
But that makes sense, doesn't it? Because I mean, it's always a weird thing when you get into films. You think, well, why are films so filled with words when, as a kid? And I wonder what films you first fell in love with as a child, because they're not, you don't fall in love with snappy lines of dialogue, you fall in love with pictures.
It was a very picture-led thing, as you say. It was the film that really excited my imagination. I remember it with clarity until my dying day, was Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, on TV, of course, not in the cinema, and seeing hearing this Mancini music and the nighttime atmosphere and the kind of velvet world, and there was something there that I didn't understand. I now know it was sex and race, but I knew there was something beyond my reach, and so that was there was a sense of of the darshan, of the removal of the curtain, of the entering, crossing a threshold, stepping literally across a threshold into a domain which I would now call movies, which was deeply exciting.
But this must all be fiction, I'm guessing. I mean, because obviously at that point documentary wasn't, you saw TV documentaries, and there were documentaries which were quite tightly formatted for TV, but you didn't really see documentaries which were made for the big screen.
Not at all. However, having said that, coming from Belfast, where I came from, I remember with real clarity a really concerning coincidence. I saw my aunt had one of these old bootleg video players, so I saw The Exorcist when I was like way too young, like 14 or 13, whatever age it was. However, at the same time, I remember there was either a World in Action or a panorama about the war in Belfast. And I remember seeing an open coffin on screen and a dead body in that coffin. And these two things were fused in my head in some way. The like this kind of diabolical world of mist that was The Exorcist, and something that was happening right next to us. And of course The Exorcist terrified me, and this other thing terrified me as well. And it was the kind of the only thing I can say now is that I drew a conclusion of the potency of the image, and the fact that in a weird way what happened up there wasn't a million miles away from what was happening around me, even though I came from a society where there were no filmmakers, there was no culture, as it were. Nonetheless, this weird connection between The Exorcist and this horrible death that I had seen on TV fused something in me.
I suppose the thing is, at that age, the borders between what we now think of as documentary and fiction are very porous anyway, because it is just images, and it's particularly at that era, it's things that you just stumble into on TV and things that you see far too young, and you're too young for all of it, and it's all just images and fragments of narrative, and one thing being quote-unquote real and one thing being quote-unquote fiction doesn't mean very much when you're that age.
Absolutely, and it's still, to a certain extent, that's the case. Of course, it's very, very right to draw moral and ethical and aesthetic and ideological boundaries between fiction and non-fiction, but I always think it's like a San Andreas fault on which they're built, and it's a shifting sand, and there are all these eruptions of things that happen, and something that is built on a fault line is intrinsically unstable, but boy is it interesting as well. So I think that when I look back at my work, I think there's there's a kind of play, a little bit of play between those boundaries.
So what happens then? I mean, we started by discussing the career in science that never was. What happens after that point? What happens once that doesn't get pursued?
So
and this other road gets taken.
So I went to university and studied non-science things. I studied film and film history, art history, and a wee bit of philosophy thrown in, which was in Scotland, and it was a really good combo looking back, because both looking at images and then the philosophy teaches you a bit of thinking about images as well. And so I did that for 4 years. I didn't touch a camera at all in that time. Often when people study film now, they are trying to get into the production process, but I didn't touch any of that. And you could say that was a kind of deceleration of my ambition to make films, but actually it didn't feel that way, because what I was learning was how to look, I think, and how to inspect an image and also enjoy an image. It was never filtered too much through my brain. It felt quite childlike, quite primitive, quite passionate. We were looking at Caravaggio, we were looking at Derek Jarman and these courses, etc. Exciting stuff.
Was that a conscious decision on your part then to actually kind of reject the camera at that stage, or was it simply that it wasn't on offer?
Both, and also a third thing, fear. That kind of, I don't know if there's a word, I'm sure that you could make some Greek or Latin word which means fear of buttons, you could say technophobia or something, but I brought this camera along, we might talk about it later, but there's one button on that, and I liked this camera because there was one single button. And when I started making films, I was very young, and the cinematographers and sound people were a lot older, and they were all guys, of course, and there were loads of buttons, and it was like, don't even go near there because that is not your realm. You're the quote girl, i.e. you won't know that stuff, so don't even think about it. There's this division of labor, and what happens was I became scared of the camera in some way. This is not for me. I don't even look through it, and that was a technological thing, and over nearly 30 years of filmmaking, what has happened is that has gone away, and that process, that untouchability, that reverie of the camera has gone, and I started shooting, and now the cameras are that size.
Well, I was going to say, because some of that must be psychological, but also
yes.
it wouldn't have been helped by the fact that this is mid to late 80s, and the camera equipment you're talking about would have been it's like having a kind of spaceship strapped to yourself.
Yeah.
So in that case, how do you get from there to then, we're going to look at the first clip. We have a range of clips throughout from Mark's career to look at. And the first is you go into TV and you start making TV documentaries. So how does that happen?
I had an idea for a TV documentary, and I wrote it, this sounds like an apocryphal story, I wrote it on a napkin in a cafe, and I sent the napkin off to Channel 4, and they commissioned the napkin.
That was Channel 4.
Channel 4, not now, obviously. Well, maybe they would do that now. So I did that. I was a series of short films with Alan Cumming, the actor, and then, they were not bad, but they weren't all that great. I didn't know my craft, and then I started making more stuff, and you can see, that joy, if any of you make stuff, that joy of getting better, of going from rubbish to a bit better still, was a great thing. You can feel, it's like, we're using words now, you can feel your lexicon increasing, and I could feel my visual lexicon increasing. And so then toward in the early 90s, I thought, why don't I try and make something really ambitious, really serious, and when I was 18, I had read Martin Gilbert's book Holocaust, and I remember sitting in Edinburgh and just shaking at what I was reading, and so I thought, why not aim big, and so came up with the idea of making a film about Holocaust denial in a way.
Okay, and that film was called Another Journey by Train, wasn't
yes.
it? Okay.
And a guy had come to me, a fellow filmmaker had come to me and said, let's make a film about the children of the survivors of the Holocaust. And I thought that was a good idea, but I thought I'd seen that a lot before. And I had seen an amazing documentary, which I'm sure many of you will have seen, called The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On by Kazuo O'Hara. How many of you have seen that film? Oh, good, great. And you remember how aggressive is this? Is an explosive film. This is a film about one man trying to kick the truth out of another man. And I thought, why don't we use that explosive idea to make a kind of plant dynamite under a film? So I thought, wouldn't it be good if we found a bunch of people, young men who are impervious to truth, who deny that Auschwitz-Birkenau was a homicidal place where 1 million people died, and bring them to that place and introduce them to someone who was there during those deaths.
But we're going to see a clip from the film, which is incredibly kind of potent and powerful. But let me just clarify something first, which is, you mentioned these little films of Alan Cummings. I mean, at that stage, was that fiction? I want to clear up this kind of fiction documentary thing first.
Well, it was half and half. I scripted Alan's bits, but then we interviewed people and we intercut them. So it was like he was interviewing them, except that it was scripted. So it was, again, that San Andreas fault.
Okay. So back to Another Journey by Train, which is 1993, I think. I mean, do you want to contextualise? We've sort of mapped out what the film is,
yes,
what it is, and its essence. Do you want to contextualise this clip in particular?
Yeah, this clip is towards the end of the film, and there are 4 young Holocaust deniers in the film, one from Scotland, one from Austria, one from Germany, one from France, and they were in some way nice guys, can I say, but we had lied to them and said that we wanted to make a film about what they called nationalism, and we said we're going to take you to Berlin to talk about nationalism and employment, etc. When we got to Berlin, we put the camera on each one of them singly, and I had tickets. They thought they were going home, and I had tickets in my pocket from Berlin onwards to Poland, and I said to each one of them on camera, okay, we've lied to you so far. We had to be honest with them. We'd like you to come to the place that you deny the existence of and meet somebody who was there.
And their response was?
Well, you're about to see. It wasn't very nice.
Okay, so let's have a look at this.
Now, I came into Auschwitz, and that's my number. This is my number, actually, 99934. It's been in a bottle for many years because I haven't done anything to it. This was my mother's number. My number came from my arm, which I had removed for a very good reason. Well, many reasons, but this is my skull. But I had it removed because I thought I remove it out of my head.
I've heard all this 10,000 times.
But you haven't seen it here with a person.
I have seen it here. I've been here like 30 times.
But I'm talking to the other chaps
been here
as
with
well.
survivors and stuff, so
but
I
I'm
don't
talking
have to
to the
listen to
others
this
as well.
anymore.
Okay,
No?
I'm
If
talking
anybody
to.
wants to listen,
Well, you can go
it's
home.
not the basic thing for me.
No, okay, we're fine. You know what this building is? It's called the Blockführerstube. And Blockführerstube. And here stood the SS, and people went out to work from the women's camp. That's the men's camp. But I don't want to talk about how people survived here, okay, and how they lived here. I just want to tell you about the pure machinery of murder. So let's just come over here. The trains came in here. People were thrown out of the trains, and all their luggage was left. All the stuff was just left behind, okay? Then people came to work here from the Canada Commando, the men, and took all the belongings over to the Canada section, right? Then people were put up here and segregated, men on one side, women on the other side. Here stood the SS doctors and carried out the selections, okay? So 20% of people, sometimes 15% of young girls and young boys were allowed to come into the camp, okay?
I refuse to talk to you anymore.
No, we don't talk. That's fine. You don't have to. You don't have to. Now, did you know there was a trial here in 1988? Did you know about the trial in Wuppertal?
Yeah.
You do?
Problem.
No problem. Your
propaganda.
problem.
If you said Hitler, dich soll der Schlag treffen, he came to concentration camp, I can understand this. I said Bundespräsident Weizsäcker is an idiot, and I was in prison for that.
Did you
care.
know in
Totally don't care.
1988 came Wunsch, Grönig, Hahn, Lawrence.
There's a Demjanjuk trial going on, packed with lies.
They all came.
Because there was
Right. They
This
all
is the
came.
new
Pardon?
religion here.
Yes.
The anti-fascism is the new
Yes,
religion.
okay,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
The Christian
Now then,
religion
let
is
me
there,
tell
and
you-
then the male.
Let me tell you about Wunsch. Where's the plan of Wunsch? I have got
Let
it.
me
We've
tell
got
you
the plan
about
of
the
Wunsch.
problems today.
Right? Oh, the problems today. Oh, we've got big problems today.
Yeah,
That's right. For you, it is a money-making
masochism.
enterprise,
it's a
isn't
money-making.
it?
For
How
us,
do
it's
you
a
enjoy-
money-making.
How do you
We
enjoy
finance
your
mass
Porsche?
murdering of Palestinians in Israel. We
How
are
do-
forced to
we
finance the
don't care.
Holocaust and Palestinians.
The Holocaust has
by
been
Jewish
marvelous
lies.
for
I'm not
you.
interested in listening to
How
this
marvelous
anymore.
was the Holocaust for you? A money-making business for you, the Holocaust.
Yeah, I made so much money.
Of course, you run your Porsche cars. And who finances you, huh? Do you know the real Nazis that were here?
Yeah.
They don't want to come back. We've tried to bring them back. You know why they don't want to come back? Because they've learned their lesson.
So that's a wrenching scene to watch. And I mean, it's the kind of scene that you see, you kind of feel it on your skin somehow. And that's just watching it now, 20-something years later. So you're there. I mean, are you operating the camera in that scene?
No, I wasn't operating in the
But
camera.
you're
David
standing.
Smith, yeah.
Okay, but you're there with the cameraman. So I mean, what are your memories of that filming that scene? Because there's a kind of incendiary quality and also a kind of a genuinely hazardous unpredictability and just not knowing. I mean, even watching that, you're not knowing where this is going.
And you know, it went for 7 minutes, and then they fucked off. And you know, it was horrible. But spent a couple of weeks with them by then. And Kitty Hart, this brilliant woman, Kitty Hart Moxon, had agreed to do this, and and she went in, as you can see, all guns blazing. And you could say that she could have taken a different approach, but it's her prerogative to choose whichever approach she likes. You know, and she seemed not too nervous. Of course, I remember puking up that night, the night before. You know, just the kind of fear and telling them what we were doing. And Ewald Altan's the German guy. Was it him? I can't remember which one said, "Oh, I've got a gun. Can you get rid of my gun?" etc. And so it was horrible. I had been to Birkenau once before, but to go there and film there and have this kind of live, fearful event was not pleasant. But then what you realise is that this is a kind of submissive thing. We had set up this situation, but we simply did not know what would happen, and that's an aspect of documentary that's so important, that you submit to something outside yourself, and a kind of collision happens between you and the world, or you and something that you care about, and this kind of moral concern, the kind of anger that drove this film, culminated in that. But they all left, and then she continued and told us what she saw.
Because you're clearly very angry, and there's an anger running through the film, but equally they're very pissed off neo-Nazis there, you know. And I found one of them on what they call, as you say, nationalist forums now, still talking about the film, and saying, I think the quote which I wrote down was that he said, "I told cousins I wasn't getting filmed with no Jew." So there's that going on, and you're kind of wrangling these guys.
Well, I don't remember him saying that, and if he did, he came here, so he was filmed with a Jewish person, you know. And none of them, even when we said we want you to come onwards to Birkenau, none of them said no. None of them struggled. You can see a diversity within that. The French guy moves with the camera over to this side and is listening, but some of the others are walking the other way. And what happened afterwards is really interesting. The big tall German guy, Ewald Altan, maybe some of you know, he's very famous, and he turned anti-Nazi and came out as gay and became oppositional. And
yeah, they weren't happy with him on the nationalist
not at all. No. And the Austrian guy, the guy with the round glasses, was imprisoned for his Holocaust denial. I think he should have been imprisoned for other things, frankly, like race attacks rather than Holocaust denial, but whatever. And so the aftermath was complicated.
And making that kind of complicated material for British TV at that point, I mean, how complicated was that? Because TV is a world, I mean, you know, the 90s were a different era in some respects, and Channel 4 was a free and liberal place in some respects, but at the same time, TV is built on permissions and the right contracts having been signed, and basically a fear of anyone getting sued. So how difficult was that landscape to navigate?
It was I think we went to the BBC with this, and they said no. So this was for Channel 4, but it's in the spirit of the BBC, that kind of idea that you don't use a commentary, that you make a very observational cinema, that the camera is on the shoulder, etc., that you see what happens. You know, it's a classic, there's a sort of neoclassicism about it, a classic way of documentary filmmaking that came out of Canada and France and America in the late 50s and early 60s, and that was in that spirit. This was, even though this is passionately the content that I was interested in making, I now look at the form, and I think that's not me. I think the next clip that we have is much more me. It was visually different. I was shooting myself, etc. So when you're young, you're still searching for your style, as it were. You know, I had, this is the anger of youth, but I hadn't found my own style yet.
But before we get to that next clip, I mean, there's this kind of point in your career where, and this is where I first encountered you, I guess, you know, and it feels like at the time that you put the camera down. Now, I don't know if you did literally put the camera down, but obviously at that point you focus, you're curating and heading up the Edinburgh Film Festival.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's talk about that first, because the whole thing with festivals, people will probably be aware, Cannes announced its lineup this week. I mean, festivals can be a myriad things. You know, there's as many different festivals under the sun as you can imagine. But the festival director's job in some respects is to kind of make sure there are starry premieres and that photos are being taken. And you took Edinburgh in a very different direction right from the start, it felt like. I mean, what was your kind of mission, your guiding principle?
When I was director of Edinburgh Film Festival, I think there were something like 200 film festivals in the world. Now somebody estimated that there are 9,000. But even then, I wanted to be distinctive in some way, you know. So I didn't go after big premieres because I was even then very hard to get, much harder now. So I decided to do something called scene by scene. So every night at 6 o'clock, we would have a major discussion like this with clips, and I would have edit control here on stage. So I would be doing that and playing the clip and slow-moing it and pausing it, and it was Coen Brothers and Bertolucci and Cronenberg and lots of people. So the idea was to try to do something a bit distinctive.
So you're kind of responsible for the Q&A format. And then obviously also you're appearing on screen kind of at the same time or shortly thereafter, because again, you know, I remember seeing you taking over from Alex Cox, the director Alex Cox, and hosting Movie Drome, and then that becomes Scene by Scene. And I wanted to ask you about that specifically, because the thing I remember even at the time was that you were always credited not just as presenter, but director as well. And TV is a world where it's kind of impossible to author things properly, but it seemed like you were quite quick and quite deliberate at taking that control.
Yeah, I directed Scene by Scene. I didn't direct Movie Drome, that was somebody else. But I directed Scene by Scene simply because I wanted that control. The chat shows, conversations on TV then were anecdotal. It was journey down memory lane. It was about somebody's love life, and those are sort of interesting afterwards in the bar. But actually, I wanted to talk about Polanski or David Lynch or Lauren Bacall or Janet Leigh or Jane Russell or Martin Scorsese or all those people that I interviewed. I wanted them to talk to them about craft stuff. How do you shoot and cut? How do you stand in front of a camera and hold your space within the frame? And so I thought, if I'm directing that, then I'll have control of that, and I won't have somebody tell me, oh, well, ask Sean Connery who he shagged, sort of thing. You know, it won't be like that in a way. And so that's why I directed. It was hard because there were 2 tracking cameras, and it was me and the person, and we never shot in a studio, and so it would be me and David Lynch or Polanski flouncing off, and Woody Allen not even looking at the film clips that I was showing him. So there was a lot of stuff going on, as well as the actual directing of the camera. But I kind of liked that, and I particularly liked, by directing, I liked having control of the edit, because I thought there must be people out there like me who want to hear about film craft, and there wasn't a lot then on film craft. There was some good stuff, very good stuff, and before that there was some very, very good stuff. But that's what I wanted to get into. How do you make a shot and a cut?
But it feels like at that point you then make a decision as well, which is to focus on your command of the camera and to stop being in front of the camera as well.
Yeah. I never liked being in front of the camera. You know, people are better in front and some are better behind, and I just loved looking through the camera. As I said to you earlier, I was encouraged to stand away from the camera because I wouldn't understand it. But then technology changed, cameras got simpler, and I decided to make a film in a part of the world, northern Iraq, in a village called Goptapa. And to my amazement, you know, all these big macho cameramen that I talked about earlier, suddenly none of them were available, and none of them wanted to go to Iraq and actually shoot in a dangerous place. So it fell to me to shoot, and so I found myself shooting for the first time a film that I was also directing.
It's a strange old world, isn't it? Yeah, we're going to jump forward, kind of, and then we're going to do a bit of back and forth with chronology. But we're going to jump forward to the first movie, which is 2009. And I mean, that is you directed before then, but the first movie, by its very nature, I guess, is you see that as your first statement, your first.
It was the first feature-length thing I'd done. Before that, I'd done shorter things. This is the first feature thing. And should I introduce this clip?
Yeah, why don't we?
Yeah. So this is a clip set in this village called Goptapa that I mentioned, and it's a film about children, Kurdish children in the north of Iraq, and I travelled through there and loved the place, and my producer had separately done the same. And of course, the politics of the time were such that the Middle East was more in our consciousness and in the news a lot. And I wanted to try and capture the placeness of the place, you could say. And so I thought, and I'd met some of these children, and I realized that none of them had seen a movie on the big screen before. And I thought, what if they made a movie? What if they made their first movie? And so the clip we're about to see is, I don't know, about 30 minutes into the picture. And so far, we have gone to the village and met a bunch of children, and we've shown them films on a big screen made of my bed sheets, and they've seen E.T., and they've seen an Iranian film called The Boot, Chakma, and they've seen a bunch of other films. And this is the next morning, immediately after they've seen those films, and I brought this object along. You'll see this is the red boot that appears in the film. And the reason I bring that is that each time you make a film, I'm sure there are lots of filmmakers here, each time you make a film, you give yourself an aide-memoire also. And I said in this one, objects. Think of film objects, because so many of the great Iranian films are about a goldfish or a balloon or a boot or something. And so you'll see here immediately objects that had appeared in the films that they had seen the night before. And then the children stand against the wall and they start talking and look at the objects in this scene, and also look at how the camera moves. This is the first time I'd been shooting something, but look what happens.
So this is the first time that you'd actually taken the camera and just done this?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's worth bearing in mind.
Very scary.
Can I just check, was I in anyone's way when I'm sitting down? I am, okay, right, I'll crouch. All right.
Sessiga.
Look at the boy in the middle in red. He's got a gun in one hand and a bird in the other.
If you could make a film, what would it be about? What would happen in the film about the dog, the donkey, and the goat?
شيرو دارو فيلم شارسك بيه دوسك كمان شارسك بيه نيرا كده ما كان بس كمان سجى كمان لقى كده ما كده ما قبل سجى كمان كده دوسك كمان كده بس سجى كمان إيه ما كده كبقوا
Let the doctor to eat the donkey. A dog couldn't eat a donkey. A donkey's too big.
الله
استغنات أنا كرزو قوري.
كرزو بزنا وزاني
Yeah.
بزن ما بقى بزن.
Okay, I'll let him to eat. I'll let him to eat the goat.
بزن ما بقى لا تتولى.
Who else would want to make a film? What would you make it about? I got there for him, Druski. He said, I will make a film about love. Who would? The red one. Okay, tell me about the film. Why would he make a film about love? What about a horse film again?
Erg goed.
Is he okay?
So these kids would make movies about animals, love, and the people who tried to kill them. Some kind of recipe, some kind of fireworks. Their minds are Aladdin's caves, I think. The Belfast Boys was. This is why we're here, I realise. To try and film in those caves. So I asked the kids to write stories.
When you're making a documentary, you're not directing, you're co-directing. Those kids were co-directing, and that's really exciting for me, you know. And I remember so well. The other thing, when you're filming and you're in such a zone, so I'm shooting this, I'm trying to see who's talking, which boys were talking, and you're panning. I never do pans, but there were pans in there, no cuts, but pans, because you're trying to look which boy is grabbing his crotch and which boy is pushing the other boy out of the way, and the exhilaration of that. And then when they're saying interesting stuff as well, and my translator's telling me, and I'm getting some of it, but you hear he's not telling me all of it, and that exhilaration, you know, that's when I felt, for me, I was learning a lot on this film. That sense that you have to submit in some way, that you are co-directing, that there's that this collision between you and the people that or the world that you're filming is where the spark comes from.
So was it only later that you went back and looked at that and realised what was happening around the edges of the frame the entire time? Because you've got, I mean, what feels quite, I mean, you know, we could talk about that scene in particular all night, but it feels like life is spilling into the composition the whole time. You've got feet coming in, heads coming in, arms coming in. And I mean, did you know that visually when you're actually standing there? Did you realise that?
You could tell. I was looking through the camera, listening to the translator, and looking at the kids, and you could see all that going at once. And when you're a filmmaker, especially a novice filmmaker, you want to create life within your frame, frankly. You want to capture life, and to see all that going on, all those young human beings doing all the interesting stuff and sparking off each other verbally, and look at the body language, turn the sound off, look at that body language, the excitement of that. And especially if you have come to decide that you want a more rigorous frame, and I had done, you know, this is on a tripod, most of this film shot on a tripod. I wanted to use the tripod. I wanted to get away from that handheld observational fly in the wall style. So you need vitality somewhere, and there it was in that scene. So I felt I was learning so much by doing something like this.
And kids kind of straight away, and that kind of the kid's imagination and their kid's eye view, that seems like a refrain right from the start. I mean, again, was that something that you knew that you wanted to investigate, or was that something where you just thought, okay, what's going on that's interesting here? Of course it's the kids.
It wasn't as rational as that, to be honest, Danny. It was more just thinking of my own childhood and the response to that kind of life that I felt, and a kind of complicated life, because it was in Belfast and it was in a time where there was a lot going on. There was a complexity. There were no-go areas. It wasn't a utopia, and I think looking back, I've been attracted to other non-utopias where the children or adults have a kind of fortitude despite the bad stuff, despite the main melody, despite the kind of drone, you could say, despite the swash and backwash of war, all those things. I think I've been, looking back, I've been very attracted to those places where people do that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I was worried it might sound a little trite, but I was going to ask whether there was like a direct line from the boy growing up in Belfast to then this attraction to Iraq and to Iran as well, which is that idea of disrupted childhoods and that idea of something bubbling away under the surface the whole time.
I would say something like, if you start with a place that has its own anxiety, then some filmmakers go out in the world, especially documentary filmmakers go out in the world, look for some grit or truth or reality. And for me, I wasn't searching for grit. I never have been, because I had quite a lot of that. Thank you very much. So you want to mix that grit up with something else. And when I look at a film like this one, I realize that what I'm doing was taking what I knew, which is children in a bit of difficulty, but looking at sort of how I, in a way, dealt with that, which was through cinema, this consolation, this thing that took me by the hand, and also a kind of recovery. There was a recovery. I wasn't traumatized by growing up in Belfast. It in some way just tenderized me. I think I say in this film, it tenderizes children like meat is tenderized when it's battered, and so there's that kind of feeling, and so there's this kind of acknowledgement of that, I would say.
You seem so particularly fascinated by children's imaginations and what's inside
Yes.
children's heads, and giving
Yes.
like kids like these a chance to tell their stories, and it keeps coming back in your films. I mean, you
Yes.
mentioned a story of children in film again,
Yeah.
and something which comes through there is maybe that's to do with where people are globally, and maybe it's also to do with class. I mean, I remember talking to you about that at the time, the idea of people who don't get, and kids particularly, who don't get to tell their stories and don't get, and because that's such a huge power, the power to control the narrative, to tell other people your narrative.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also that idea that when we grow up, we professionalize in some way, and we start to wear a kind of uniform of self and a kind of adult self. And at some point you have to go through an on-schooling and on-learning to get back to some of the vitality, some of the instinctive qualities you had as a child. That famous thing that Picasso said, that all children are artists. There's something in that, and that, like, I met your boy this evening, and look at, like, he was sparky, and he was throwing out all sorts of ideas, and you need to be disinhibited, I think, and too many of us adults are afraid to be like that because you think they might laugh at me, which is one of the big fears in adulthood and childhood as well. And so I think that the celebration of this, I'm going to hold my crotch and talk about donkeys eating dogs and dogs eating donkeys. Like
a great sounding film.
It's surrealism. Yeah, it's great.
And how much of that to do, I mean, we've touched on this already, but I think it's worth kind of digging a bit more into it. How much of that is to do with you being a product of the digital age? Because obviously, I'm sure everyone in the room is a film lover, and so we all have that romanticism about 35mm and about the old style way of filmmaking. But you couldn't operate in that world, surely, and surely part of what has allowed you to take that voice is cheap digital cameras.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm massively for that. I'm really, really influenced by Iranian cinema, one of the great Iranian filmmakers, Mania Akbar, he's here in the front row this evening, Abbas Kiarostami, and many of these people who said the ideal is to remove the camera at all. Abbas says the ideal would be to make a film without a camera. It's like a football match. Go in beforehand, tell them what to do, isn't this right, Mania? Tell them what to do, and then stand on the sidelines and let them do it, which is the great film 10 that Mania starred in and had a huge creative control over, driving around in a car. You know, Abbas is out of the picture, frankly, you know, and it's let people get on with the job, create the circumstance and let them get on with it, and that's a digital idea. That isn't really a film era idea, that I think.
But let's talk about the story of film, because, you know, we've touched now on history. And the story of the film, it's a book before it's a film, and chronologically it comes before the first movie. I mean, is that?
Well, the first movie was released before the story of film, and shot at the middle of the story of film. So it's right in a way. In my head, it comes after the first movie because the story of film took a long time. For those of you who don't know, it was a 15-hour film telling the history of the movies, the history of innovation in the movies, and it shot over a 6-year period, etc. And just as I was growing up and changing as a filmmaker, so digital technology was changing. The other big thing that happened to me was that I traveled the world. I drove from Scotland to India in my camper van. I made the story of film, which took me around the world. And so I was learning. The center of geography of my head was changing. It was going, frankly, eastwards towards Asia, and so those two things at the same time were the product of the story of film. And so the story of film, which was made for not very much money, was the product of my traveling and also digital change, I would say.
And it's kind of marrying, I guess it feels like, in the context of this conversation, a marrying of the looking that you started out with.
Yes,
you know, with suddenly you've now got the tools to turn that looking and that gaze into, I don't know, turn it back on itself or represent it or something, you know, to kind of to take ownership of what you had seen all those years before.
That's right. And it was also something like a kind of thank you to cinema. You know, when cinema had been this friend, and this was a way of saying, oh, okay, thank you for that, and some kind of detour through it. And I had always had a kind of some synoptic imagination, as you could say. I was always interested in the big arc, the kind of Galileo. What would Galileo think? You know, that sort of thing. And so I thought, oh my God, you know, I was still in my 30s, but why don't? Was I still in my 30s? Yeah, when I wrote the book, I was still in my 30s. Why don't I just try and tell a history of movies? And that's ridiculous, but because the history of movies has been told mostly by white middle-aged guys like me, you know, but I was determined not to make some of those category errors, you could say, and so I embarked on it and thought, fuck it, what's the worst that can happen? It's just a shit thing, you know. And
yeah, well, it was. I mean, category errors is, I think, where we'll pick it up after we watch the clip. But I think we should probably introduce the clip. I'll be interested actually after showing it and digging into why you chose this particular.
Why this clip? Yeah, I don't know. I think this particular bit made my producer cry, as I recall, and so it's just a bit of a very well-known filmmaker, Ozu, and we've got a little bit where we're talking about what style he used in his films in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and also, you know, there aren't many interviews in the story of film. I knew it was not going to be a talking head piece. You know, I said it's not going to be TV, it's not going to be styled like TV, etc. It's going to be images and voice, but there is a bit of an interview in this. But it's a woman who was in Tokyo Story of Ozu, so that's allowable. Let's look at the clip.
Kagawa played the youngest daughter in Ozu's most acclaimed film, Tokyo Story. Late in the film, the mother takes ill and the daughter fans her to cool her body.
例えば私の場合はお母さんが病気で倒れてうちわでこう仰いであげてるカットがある。そして手を下ろしてこう時計を見て駅にお兄さんたち迎えに来ますっていうカットがあったんですけれども、うちわを3回だったかな5回だったか動かしたら手を下ろして時計を見てっておっしゃったんですね。だからその通りにやったんですけれども、その時になんかこう監督さんのこうリズムみたいなものがおありなのかなって思ったんですけれど、 だいたいカメラの位置が低くてこう床を見せないでこう低いとこう天井も入るしなんか立体感が出るっていうかなんかそういうお考えもあったように思いますね。
Kagawa's story gets to the crux of Ozu. He used film like no other director before or since. It was the norm in the 30s to have a camera at this height. Filming from hip height rather than shoulder height put the camera at the body's centre of gravity and, therefore, gave the image a better feeling of balance. This seldom happened in cinema. In the 70s, Chantal Akerman's groundbreaking film Jeanne Dielman was one of the few movies which used Ozu's camera height. And this was only the start of Ozu's innovations. As we've seen, actors' eye lines in mainstream cinema were usually like this, but in Ozu movies they were often here. In conventional films, when actors talked to each other, the camera would usually be at this angle to them, about 45 degrees. This, as we've seen, was to make it look as if the actor's eyes connected across the cut. Ozu brought his camera right round between the actors, into the scene at 90 degrees. The actors didn't seem to quite look at each other, but the composition of the images matched each other visually. Ozu was very interested in matching his shots, whether they were of human beings or, say, interiors in a house looking down a corridor. The more you watch, the more you feel the order of the space in his movies. His frames were windows on very balanced pictorial worlds.
That's kind of obvious stuff in a way, but it's worth doing. It's worth. I was talking to my 15-year-old self here. Really, I wanted to make pretty clear and some of this stuff that was going on to somebody like me who might fall in love with cinema.
Well, I wondered, because the thing about, probably by accident, the thing about the story of film was that it instantly made a lot of film studies courses kind of obsolete, and I wondered how how much it was supposed to be a kind of celebration and how much it was, it was, this educative thing that was suddenly, because, even for those of us who thought we knew film, suddenly, there were things that we knew that you made us see slightly differently, and there were things that you were just introducing for the first time.
Yeah, there's a lot of African cinema in there. I got, it's very nice. It's in film courses, around the world, and that's very nice. And people who teach film say thank you. That's very useful because it does help augment. If lots of people teach this stuff, but if you're teaching an undergraduate, you don't often get onto Senegalese cinema of the 70s, for example, and that's all in there.
It felt like a big part of the project. It reminded me, there's an image of you, I saw a photograph of you with Tilda Swinton. You did something called the 8.5 Foundation, which was to basically to show a film on a child's 8.5 birthday.
Our idea was that on a child's 8.5 birthday, that was a threshold moment, like a bar mitzvah, that they would step across the border into cinema. So we made a big fancy thing about that.
And the reason I mention it is because as part of that, there was the two of you and a group of others as well, a group of reprobates kind of brought in to physically drag a cinema screen around the Highlands, wasn't it? And I just remember there was that sense of physical labour to it. And it felt with the story of film a similar thing was going on, that you were trying and you were trying to change people's, like the baseline of where people were looking at film from, which is, no matter how much we try to educate ourselves, if you grow up in the West, you see things through a Hollywood lens. And it felt like almost this kind of arduous physical attempt to kind of to turn that around and to say, well, actually, no, globally, we need to look physically, we need to literally look in the other direction.
Yeah, it was to get away from the word education into something much more like religion almost. I was brought up very Catholic, and I have no Catholic faith whatsoever, like 0. But I thought maybe we could use the techniques of Catholicism and apply them to something more interesting, like cinema, and so that's why we pulled this 37.
We're going to have priests and
truck. This 37-ton truck across Scotland. That idea of the pilgrimage of the sacred place. I hope my voice holds out. The sacred place. This is these cinemas in which we now are have got many things in common with churches and chapels, obviously, and so it was stealing some of those ideas.
And the other thing it seemed like you were doing as well was you know, we all have that idea. I think we're presented with that idea that there are filmmakers over here, and there are kind of critics and audiences over here, and that you seem to be collapsing those. And it was actually, okay, so here is an act of filmmaking, which is also an act of film criticism, and you know, that entire wall just suddenly got demolished.
Yeah. For the 8.5 Foundation and the pilgrimage thing that you mentioned, Tilda and I felt passionately that film criticism isn't something necessarily that you write in a newspaper every week. Film criticism can be pulling a cinema across town, it can be a devotional act, it can be a comedy act, it can be a sort of event, it can be dancing. Like we would play, we played an old Busby Berkeley film that was suggested to us by Joel Cohen, and then it was finished, and we thought, oh, we really like that musical number, should we do it again? And so we played it again, and then we drank some more, and we said, well, we'll play it again, but dance naked this time. Yeah, let's do that. And so it's that kind of physical, bodily Dionysian, you know, they're fancy terms for this. If you read Merleau-Ponty, he writes about all this, sort of using your body as a way of expressing your love for something. That's a bit fancy, I know, but it was all that sense of the kind of joy, optimism, not being a brain in a jar. And too many film critics are brains in jars, I think.
I'm going to take that quite personally.
I was not referring to you.
You were like making eye contact when you said that. I mean, practically, on a really like basic level, I mean, I wonder where you got your film education, because we kind of come from the same era, and obviously, you know, you can go a long way through stumbling into things on TV. And I mean, I was kind of lucky in a way that I'm not sure you were. I grew up in Brighton, which was, we had an art house cinema, and I came up to London, so I had a certain amount of access. Even then, it's difficult to kind of to be encyclopedic. I mean, before, again, another change with digital is that suddenly everything is there. If we know what to look for, we can find it very easily. Whereas just on a really practical level, how a lot of the things that you were talking about in Story of Film, how would you even come across them?
Yeah, well, it's the impulse. I knew that there was loads I didn't know. I had a massive ignorance, and I somewhere along the line thought, why don't I, you know, fall in love with my own ignorance, which is another Ponzi thing to say, but you know what I mean? Like, why don't I become interested in what I don't know rather than what I do know? A lot of people, and that's brilliant, if they love Billy Wilder's The Apartment, they'll watch it again and again and again and again. Me too, to a certain extent. But the better thing is to get on to the stuff that you don't know. If you hear the name of a filmmaker that you don't know, so say for example, I say Asya J. Bar here, some of you will know who she is, and a lot of you won't know who she is. DJEBAR, by the way. And why not think, oh, I haven't heard of her, why not go find out about her? And so that, at a relatively early age, I realized I had that kind of centrifugal imagination, which meant I wanted to leapfrog over what I knew and get into what I didn't know. And so to answer your question directly, all I would do is read books. I read English, obviously, and I read French pretty badly, but nonetheless I can. So I would read books in English and French about African cinema, Middle Eastern cinema, etc., and then find it somehow. That I found a video library in New York, which is gone now, called Kim's. Some of you will know it. And I would literally phone them up, and as soon as they heard my voice, they'd say, oh, Mark, is it you again? And I was still in my 20s earning nothing, and they would say, you know, that's going to be $75 plus postage. But I thought, what else? You know, I don't take taxis, and, you know, I eat pizza, and that's it. So again and again, like 3 times a week, videos would come in that I would see, Ethiopian films from many parts of the world, and they were so exciting. This is what the 8.5 Foundation came out of, this idea that you have to wait for this thing. You develop your hunger for it. You get hungry and hungry. The creation of desire and appetite, and that's where it came from. Yeah, but that's where it came from.
I'm worried your voice isn't going to hold down. Okay, we can do it with sign language, otherwise it's just placards. I want to move on because I'm aware that time is ticking on. Time in your films is something I want to talk about. Actually,
do we need to skip something?
I don't know. I think we're probably okay.
No. Okay, good.
Okay, hang on. No, we're fine. We're fine. We talked just now about the importance of digital, and the film we're going to talk about next. What is this film called? Love. It seems very purely a product of digital cameras, and it's the idea, I guess, of the digital camera as notebook. So you're not even necessarily planning out what you're going to film and then filming it. You're using it as a diary as you're going along. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a film that I made when I was just turning 40, and I realised I was no longer young. There's a point where you have to admit it. You can't pretend anymore. I'm no longer young. You know, I thought, and I realised the original title for this film was called Leaving, and it was about saying goodbye to youth thing, you know. But I started filming it. It was entirely shot with this camera, which cost flip camera cost, I don't know, £90, and with this tripod, and I was leaving a festival in America, Telluride in Colorado, and I started filming with that equipment with no other idea. There was no script of any sort, there was no producer of any sort, there was no crew of any sort, there was no schedule of any sort, there was no budget of any sort. The total cost of shooting the film was less than £10. But after the story of film, I was exhausted, and there was a lot of process, and there was a lot of describing, and I thought, how do I unplug? How do I do something punky? So I shot a film which was the opposite of telling a history of anything. You know, making a 15-hour history of something is fucking exhausting. So I just thought, why not do the opposite? I was reading tons of Virginia Woolf at that time, and she had been for a long time a hero of mine. And you know, in some of her best writings, all she's trying to do is chart the motions of her mind. A particular beautiful essay called Street Haunting that she wrote about the city of London, and she goes out one day to buy a pencil, and she doesn't need a pencil, she's got loads of pencils, but she goes out to try and just wander, and I don't know, to look into the faces of other human beings and imagine what they're thinking. And so this film, What Is This Film, Love came out of that. This is about halfway through the film. I'm traveling around with my partner, my girlfriend, and we're in California. And then there's a flashback here to 22 years earlier when I was in Berlin when the wall was coming down. And there are two voices in this film, a female voice and a male voice. And in a very Virginia Woolf, Orlando-y type way, towards the end of the film, it is revealed that the female speaker and the male speaker is the same person. And she's speaking in the past tense and he's speaking in the present, or else vice versa, I can't remember. But it was playing with voice in the way, this Chris Macquarie way that I had been watching a lot of that as well.
Okay, let's go for it.
They stopped again. The girl sat by the river and read. The guy climbed up the river's course and found this deserted place. Then he saw this leaf, trilling, flickering. Because he was such a movie nut, it looked like the movies to him. And then the leaf reminded him of something else, further back in his memories.
I thought of this place, the Unter den Linden in Berlin, so cold it makes me shiver. Napoleon marched on this street, as did Hitler. Unter den Linden means under the lime trees. These are the lime trees. In October 1989, when the Berlin Wall was still up, I came to this communist place. I picked up a lime leaf, a wee keepsake of one of the most memorable days in my life. I'd never seen communism before, never been in a city without adverts, traffic, noise, capitalism. This is the leaf I picked up. It's paper dry now. I showed the leaf the trees it came from 22 years ago. And I show it Humboldt University, where Hegel and Karl Marx studied. I can't think of anywhere I've been that has changed more in 22 years. The leaf's a stupid sentiment, of course, but it makes me think of leaving, what Berlin has left, what I have left.
He didn't leave the leaf lying there. He picked it up and took it with him, maybe for another 22 years. From the German leaf, his memory rushed forward again and skipped an ocean, as memories do, to his recent American trip with his girlfriend. To a place called Professor Valley Road. It was so beautiful that he looked down. The dusty earth made him think of the beaches in Donegal in Ireland in his boyhood, 40 years ago. And then he raised his eyes. Here, plunging into there. He wanted to be there, to lose himself in it forever. He backed away and got into the car and drove on. And then, lying in bed in his second morning in Mexico City, the guy remembered what it felt to leave those Saturn landscapes and fly to Toronto for work. In his memory, the arrival looked like something out of the film Metropolis.
The whole thing is, you know, because it's riddled with writers and poets and life experience. Yeah. Sorry. And it feels like the whole thing is almost coming to. You're saying, however precious and dear film is to us, there's also a world outside of it that actually, you know, a film can be a very hermetic and sealed off kind of world. We can become too obsessed with films. Yeah. And this feels like a statement on that. You know?
Yeah, I think it was. I think that I felt really compressed like a spring, and this was the bounce up. You know, it was the first time I'd really. Polly Harvey, PJ Harvey didn't write any of this music, but she gave me some of the music for the film, and it was the start of, you know, I used the phrase unplugged earlier, and it was the start of a time working with musicians where I thought, oh yeah, I'd started to notice more the affinity between filmmakers and musicians, and there's a kind of desirous relationship between the two, you know, and I think that an image wants to be music, and music wants to be image. They long for each other, and these two worlds do as well. I find again and again, and like an image would love to be able to do that. Brum, brum, brum. Isn't that beautiful? Could you feel it? You know, but musicians would love to be able to do what that does. You know? And so that was the start of something, and it's continued for me.
And the whole film cast feels live and kind of improvisatory. And it's that digital thing, which is you can use it as a notebook, and you can make, you know, when you watch the whole film, it feels like a film made up of connections, of thinking, okay, we go from this idea to this idea, we go from this place to this place, and it's almost like a neural thing. I mean, you talked back in the first movie.
Virginia Woolf, so Virginia Woolf, really.
I mean, we cut off just when you had the kids there, and just after we cut off, there's a moment where I think you say something along the lines of, you know, you're looking inside those kids' heads, and it almost feels with what is this film called Love, we're looking inside your head, because it's literally idea to idea, thought to thought to thought.
And also, you know, like after making a big film, you just want to make something about a tiny subject, and the most available subject to me was me. I was available and cheap, and so that's why it is a sort of self-portrait, as it were. You know, I again, you know, when you think of Albrecht Dürer, you know, his portraits of himself, he was working out. He was thinking, what is my art? And he was painting himself and doing constantly to try to think out what was his art. Think of Frida Kahlo, how she painted herself endlessly to try and work out what is my art, or Gustave Courbet, or all these great people. Like, imagine where my sentence is going to go after that. I'm going to mention myself, which is absolutely ridiculous. Nonetheless, the questioning is the same questioning.
And so just as much as that's a reaction to story of film, it then feels like there's another reaction in turn, because after this kind of rigorous examination of yourself, you then co-direct a film. Manu Akbari is sitting here in the front row. You make Life May Be, which is a...
Is it coming next, or are we going to...
Yeah, I think it is, isn't it?
No, I think it's the last clip, but we can talk about it now.
No, I think is it not? I think is it not Life May Be next?
It's the last clip, but I can play it.
What, Life May Be?
Yeah.
Let's play it now.
Should we do it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean, you should introduce Life May Be, or maybe Manu as well. I mean, it starts out as I suppose, and it's that idea you were talking about images taking the place of words.
Yeah.
Because it starts out as a kind of an exchange of letters, but they're visual letters, you know, and it's the two of you writing visual essays to each other.
Yeah, that's right. I'd met Mania in Iran, and I totally admired her work, and I wrote basically what was frankly a fan letter to her, but we turned it into a little film, and a mutual friend of ours, Isan, said, why don't you build on this? And so Mania sent me a sort of cine letter back, which was really beautiful, and then I wrote back to her, and then she sent a knockout film. And so we had now 4 pieces, and the theme of these 4 films were about our countries, our bodies, and there was a sadness in it, wasn't that right, Mania? A kind of sadness also. So we had a cumulative film of, it's moving to think of, a kind of present tense growing friendship born out of a curiosity with each other. To go, slight sideline for a moment, I was in Newcastle two nights ago, and somebody in the front row asked a question, and she said, what's it like to work in colour? Because I've never seen colour. She's never seen colour. And over the last 48 hours, I've been emailing her back and forth, and she says only recently did she know that The Wizard of Oz was in colour and black and white, and for her the yellow brick road is a grey brick road. And these exchanges between 2 people where you discover that it's something that it's in the literature of the 1800s, etc. So that's what happened with us. We just became excited. I remember I couldn't wait for your next movie, and so once Mania did this remarkable thing where she had this homage to Virginia Woolf, I thought, how the hell what do I do after that? And then sometimes the best thing is to reverse. So if we'd made a film about words and bodies, I thought, why isn't my last response to Mania no words at all? Well, you'll see 4 words on screen here, and no bodies at all, and just music and imagery that I'd built over the years. And so it's a requiem ending, and the 4 words are "Let's fall from grace." And I think what had happened is that in some way I had started to thought of our exchange as a kind of Adam and Eve type thing, because it was about bodies, but also about knowledge. So it was that idea of falling from grace.
Perfect. Let's look at the clip. mean, it's a film that feels like a very kind of pure form of communication. It makes me think about, I mean, we were talking just as people were coming in about music biopics, and I think, you know, one of the things with that is that you tend to think, yeah, but I just want to see these people play music, and so it's fascinating to see filmmakers making films to each other, you know? Yeah. And it's actually that, and it reminds me, I know Jonathan Glazer's a filmmaker you like a lot.
Yeah, a lot.
I remember talking to him and him saying, you know, again, it's that idea of, well, when did films become about the word, you know?
Yeah.
So it just feels like that was...
Yeah.
Speaking to that, I suppose, or not. Well, speaking is completely the wrong word to use, but it's that idea that, you know, it's film, so it's an image, and you capture so much on screen there. And how could you phrase that? You know?
And often when you're being interviewed, Danny, people say to you, who were you thinking of? Who was the audience for? In this case, the audience was for that one person sitting there, you know, and it was as simple as that and as pure as that. And I presume from
what I was going to say is that's the same for you, Manya.
Do you want to say anything about this, Manya?
Do you want to take the mic? Well,
no.
Okay. It's your night.
And yeah, when you're just thinking of speaking to one other person, it's the purity of the letter. It seems to work as a present tense thing. Like I did not know what she would say next, and she did not know what I would say next. And there's a kind of discovery in that.
Again, is that thread that seems to be running through everything right from the start, which is that liveness and that sense of, okay, what happens next? And again, if it was a piece of fiction, you know, maybe just because we're all used to fiction, we would know what was happening next. But because it's life, you know, it doesn't take that form. I wish we had more time to talk about life, maybe, because it's a fascinating film. Do seek it out. But I'm aware that time is against us slightly. So let's talk about I Am Belfast.
I Am Belfast.
So we've described this kind of nomadic life, you know, both visually and, you know, personally. You're a man in a camper van. And then did it always feel like you were going to come back to Belfast at some point?
No, to be honest, you know, it's just that as you talked a bit about aging, you know, I'm very aware of that being, you know, like, you know, when Einstein was a teenager, he was sitting on a trolley car and looked at the train clock in Ulm or wherever he was brought up, and he saw it receding. And that made him think of so many things, and that's what happens as you age. You know, you realise that you're on a moving trolley car, and so Belfast is a bit like that. I wanted to go back to my home patch. I've changed a lot since I lived there, but also Belfast has. You know, it has found a kind of peace of some sort, and not only that, it's found a kind of public life, and so I was really interested in that. But also, more generally, I think that cities are incredibly cinematic things. They're like our faces. They're that cinematic, and so I thought if I make a film about the place that I knew, but also the cityness of that place, the density of living, the fact that what happens when we rub up to each other in the London Underground, do we encounter each other, much do you engage, or much do you switch off? All those kind of things are the very interesting themes in urban life. And so I think Belfast was my fourth city film, but the most personal because it's about home.
And although, as you say, the city's changed a huge amount, I mean, the clip we're about to see is very much it's the Belfast of your childhood. I mean, it refers to an incident that was, I think you'd have been 6 or 7
yeah,
at that point.
That's right.
Okay.
It tells a story of a place called McGurk's Bar. It'll tell here, the narrator here, the person in the film is a brilliant actress, Helena Barine, who's playing a character who's 10,000 years old, and she's a kind of mythic storyteller, and I wanted somebody to tell a more mythic version of what happened in the city, and this is sort of quite late in the film when she tells this.
And there's something I didn't tell you about this place with the salt and sweet guys. They walk on. One passes McGurk's Bar. On the evening of the 4th of December 1971, it was busy. Christmas was coming. The bar's owner, Paddy McGurk, was serving drinks. He was proud of his place. He didn't allow swearing. There was a swear box on the counter. At 8:45 p.m, a bomb exploded in the bar, killing 15 people and wounding 17 more. McGurk's wife and daughter both died, and he and his 3 sons were injured. A few hours later, he went on TV to say that he prayed for the bombers and asking that his family's deaths should not be avenged. Many of the bodies were unrecognisable. But when one young man opened his father's coffin, he saw that the remains had 10 fingers. His father had lost a finger in a work accident, so had only 9. So the young man had to go around the houses of the other bereaved families and look in the other coffins to find his father's actual remains. The victims were all Catholics, but one soldier sent a wreath to their funerals. The song Bits and Pieces by the Dave Clark Five was in the pop charts at the time. Some observers from the opposite side of the religious divide sang it as the coffins carrying the body parts were carried to their graves.
I mean, watching that scene, it put me in mind of someone I used to know who grew up around the same time as you in Derry. She was talking about the fact that on more than one occasion, there were moments in her childhood where she was absolutely convinced, because of what was happening with the Troubles, she was absolutely convinced she was about to die, and those moments have never left her as an adult. And I wondered if that was, it was kind of, there was a rhyme there with your personal experience as well. There's that sense of death that you kind of catch as a kid.
Something like that. Yeah. We were like in bomb scares a lot, and without going into too much detail, I remember one day I have a twin brother, and I don't know what age we were, 7 or something. We were dragged away from the house, and we had to leave the house that day and never to return to the house. And so you all have these wrenches. Even though my mum and dad weren't killed by the war and like that, nonetheless, there's the sense that you are in war, like a fish is in water in some way. You're immersed in it in some way. And so yeah, it as I said earlier, that use that word tenderize, and that it tenderizes you in a sense. And in a scene like this, you know, I didn't know any of these people. But I am so incredibly impressed by this particular mural and this particular wall. How do you memorialize something? Lots of memorials in many parts of the world, including the world that I come from, intend to increase the anger or remind people of why. I would say increase the anger. This one doesn't. This has got a man with his shirt sleeves rolled up, leaning against a wall, looking out, publican, capturing a kind of everyday moment, a kind of quietude in his life. There's a man who, as it says there, you know, you to lose your wife and your daughter, and to be to injured yourself and your 3 children, and yet he did what he did. He said, no retaliation. So I think I think the scene in the film in general for me was a kind of it was a sort of pain to the idea of recovery, how that we get better, we do get better.
Do you mind if we watch the rest of that scene? I mean, it's just because it touches on the idea you just talked about, and also there's again it's that sense of time. Is that okay? Can we do that? Thank you. Sorry.
Just to make it difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
The pub was destroyed, yet it's visually here. Local people have painted the likeness of it on this underpass, where it once was. A trompe l'oeil, a creative response to destruction. Seven months later. It's Friday the 21st of July 1972. A hot summer day. Seagulls are flying around me. The bomb goes off.
Is that you're doing something kind of extraordinary with time, and it's that sense of anticipation which you never have in fiction, but you have there. So what was the decision-making process, I suppose, behind breaking up that shot before the bomb goes off?
It would the question when you're making a film like this is, do I deal with the Troubles, and if so, where? And I thought, I don't want to put it at the beginning or at the end, so at night it needed to come in the middle somewhere, and then it needed to, if you're gonna, if we're seeing through the eyes of this timeless woman, then it can become fragmented in a way, and so I wanted to slow it down. Actually, the next clip we're going to look at has got the same thing. Where is that?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That's interesting. I hadn't noticed that. That thing where you want to kind of slow it down and not have a kind of, you want to de-adrenalize it. I have to say, I've never been a fan of the thriller genre. That's the one genre I've never got, because it seems simply to, its intention is simply to increase my heart rate, and I can do that very easily, thank you very much, by all sorts of other things, you know. So I think a film should aim higher than that, you know. And for me, I want to do the opposite. Actually, I want to do what Odyssey does, which is reduce the heart rate in some way. You know, adrenaline is a very easy thing to play. And so in something like this, you just want to slow that down and add contemplation into sensation, because I think for something like this, the contemplation is more human than the sensation.
But it's interesting because it's like, I mean, it's obviously a purely unconscious thing in that case. Because when I was watching the clips, I was thinking, okay, there's clearly a thread here between what we just saw and what we're about to see, which is the last clip of the evening. And then obviously we'll get to throwing the conversation open. But this is a clip from your film Atomic. I don't know if you want to set the clip up. I mean, it kind of, I think maybe it speaks for itself a little bit. But if you want to contextualize
yeah,
it.
we're about 20 minutes into the film here, and it's a film that it's an archive film, purely archive, no shooting, that I did with the band Mogwai. And here, this is a scene, the sort of central scene in the film in a way where we're looking at the bombing of Hiroshima, and you know, I guess the sound is interesting in a way, because you would expect with like something as ferocious and awful as the bombing of Hiroshima, and a band like Mogwai is famous for its big soundscape, you would expect a lot of sound here. But also for me, so I just said, no, we need the opposite of that. We need a lot of space here, not a lot of sonic space, but also visually, and I think this is the point that you have picked up on, which I hadn't noticed it. But what you want to do is you want to break that down. I try to think, what would it be like if one girl on the ground almost saw one man in an airplane and he was about to bomb her? And so I was looking for archive footage, and I found this girl and I found this man, and we just cut them, and that was the idea of just trying to make a very simple human connection there.
Yeah, and when we look at the clip, I mean, it feels like there's this thread, and again, it's an unconscious thing, but you know, you go back to Rosie, you go back to the first movie, I mean, it feels like it's of a piece in a very harrowing kind of way.
Yeah, this is a very cheery way to end, obviously,
yeah.
But here we go. Good luck with this.
Only 2 minutes to go. The standby signal to all hands.
Those neutrons bombard other uranium atoms, causing them to split and split still others. The result? A chain reaction. Over 1 million billion atoms exploding within 2 seconds.
15, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So I just want to ask one question before handing over, which is about the mushroom cloud specifically, because I think for anyone of a certain age, you know, anyone who was around in the 70s and the 80s, the mushroom cloud was such a kind of ubiquitous image. You know, you saw it all the time, and yet after a while it ceased to mean anything. It was so divorced from what it actually meant. And what you seem to be doing here, I think, was kind of almost like ripping that image back open again and saying, okay, so here's this little icon, and then that's actually what's underneath it, that's what's inside it.
Yeah, exactly. I asked myself, why did I have nightmares about this thing? You know, because the threat was, you know, all that stuff in the news about it, and I thought, what is the unconscious energy in a piece of archive footage, and how do you capture that? And yeah, absolutely. And those imagery, most of you have seen that stuff before, and it's used in all sorts of ways. And when we first cut it, I got some, you know, Japanese no music, which is 2 sticks, and it's like, and that's what we put on it. And it was clearly that the percussive, minimal, almost threnody, prayer for the dead type aspect of it would work against this. And the mushroom cloud is the definition of the modern, is the contemporary sublime, it's the modern sublime, and so the sublime meaning terrifying. And so I just thought that if you have tiny sounds against this massive thing, it'll almost represent how small we are in front of this massive thing. So that was why these tiny noises were appropriate in stuff.
Okay, I'm aware that I hold the conversation. If you have questions for Mark, please do raise your hand. We have roving microphones, which will be roving. All I would ask is that, all I would ask is that when you do have a question, wait until the microphone is in your hand. I'm waiting for the forest of hands. Yes.
It's the question I don't expect an easy or pat answer to, but some observations. It's the question about, you mentioned, when you showed that start about the film about the Nazis going into the camp, and you described it about one man kicking the truth out of another man. And it's the question of, you know, truth and change. You talked about when you went to Berlin, it's a city that's changed over 22 years. You talked about Belfast had changed and how you changed. Over that period, has your concept of truth changed? If you could just say some observations about change and truth and conveying those truths.
Well, you're quite right. You're not going to get a quick answer to that. No, my sense of the truth hasn't changed. I still think that, I was referring to Emperor's Naked Army marches on, I still think that the guy in the film that I was referring to was right to be violent to these men in order to get the extraordinary truth. And those of you who have seen the film will remember the truth was that Japanese soldiers cannibalized each other. So that was a terrible truth. I still believe that I was morally justified in lying to the neo-Nazis in order to present them with the thing that they denied the existence of. There are truths. I was in the refugee camps on the Macedonian border recently, and I've been in Calais a few times, and these are appalling truths. These are places of ghettos, like World War II or ghettos, and I think these are truths that should be brought to us in using all the majesty of documentary. What has changed is my sense of how those truths should be brought to us. And I think that I used a more aggressive style earlier in my work, and I've now changed my approach to that and become more patient and more observant than I was back then. But I think that the idea of the compelling truths, hidden truths that are hidden in the center of the, I think it's going to be a weird metaphor, but here it comes, onion, are just as important. It's how you peel the layers of the onion that has changed for me over the years.
Yes, question here in the front. Helen, there'll be a microphone. There will be a microphone. Thank you, Chloe.
For a great discussion.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the first movie in the D.H. Lawrence film, and particularly thinking about how you like to show the filmmaking process. You kind of talk about the filmmaking process as it's happening, or editing as it's happening, particularly in the first movie. And I was wondering why, particularly, you like to kind of reveal something of the process, maybe in some of those films.
Thank you for your question. I realise that this is not something that lots of filmmakers like to do, and often I get criticised for revealing that process. But for me, you have to be honest. I like being honest from where I'm coming from. So in the first movie, for example, it starts with me leaving where I live, Edinburgh, going to Kurdish Iraq, and it starts with quite Western music, and then the music changed from Western music to Middle Eastern music as I hand the means of production, this camera, over into the hands of the young filmmakers. And it was that handover process that I was interested in, that kind of, you could say simply, friendship that I became interested in. And in the kind of purest classical way is to remove all that stuff and say that that's not interesting, and you could possibly say that it isn't interesting. But because I believe that documentary is brilliant at an encounter between the filmmaker and the world and the sparks that fly, which I think I said at the start. And also you could describe it another way, that the world comes barreling at you. Werner Herzog says the problem isn't having ideas, it's managing their assault. And if life is a kind of assault in all its excitement, then I like charting that a bit in a way. Seldom are my films always about that, about the relationship, but there's often me at the start handing over, and I find that, for me, it's useful. And to not start that way has got its own problems without starting with the speaker. Who is the speaker? What is their world? Why is she or he going into this place? I think that's quite honest and foregrounding the discourse, in a way, to use a fancy phrase.
I wonder, just to say, I just wonder about the flipping of the D.H. Lawrence one, particularly where it flips at the end with it, and that allows, maybe showing the process allows it to flip with the voice, from the voice to the sat-nav voice.
Oh yeah.
And maybe about that.
Yeah, in a number of the films, in this film that we haven't talked about this evening, about D.H. Lawrence, and also what is this film called Love, the one that we had a clip of there, in both those cases, and I think in one other, but I can't remember, there's a gender switch between female and male, or vice versa, and a lot of the films that I've made are really interested in these gender boundaries, and also, obviously, I'm a man, but I've got strong feminist opinions about women in cinema, and therefore I like to either work with women or put a female voice at the centre of the film. And so in the D.H. Lawrence film, D.H. Lawrence obviously was sort of fascinated and fucked up about gender in many ways, and so I wanted to make a film that was predicated in some of that. Again, to go back to this terrible phrase I used earlier, the San Andreas fault. You know, these kind of fault lines in this case between gender, I thought was useful to talk about D.H. Lawrence, and the bit where that happens, as you recall, is in a town called Nuoro, where he encounters a great woman writer called Graziata Leda, and so that's why the film became female at that point.
Yes, we had someone very patient here, just in the third row. This is hypnotic.
Hi Mark, thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
And for your films in general. This might be a bit boring for some people, but I'm wondering what your...
Is it a camera question?
Hmm?
Is it a question about a camera?
No. Well, I was wondering what the name... I guess I have another question about that, but just quickly. I was wondering what your thoughts are about an Iranian-American filmmaker called Kaveh Zahedi. Have you heard of him?
No.
He's he's interesting. He's kind of, there's a lot of kind of blowing the line between documentary and fiction, and kind of recreation and so on.
The name again?
Kaveh Zahedi.
Sorry, I should know.
Zahedi. Do you know? Mani, do you know him? I'm just interested. Well, anyway, he just seems like it's like an interesting analog, because I like what you said about Iranian cinema kind of wanting to get rid of the camera, and your interest in kind of getting rid of the camera, and I kind of feel like he might be interesting. I got one of his films for you if you want. like to give you as a gift.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah, just,
you're not him, are you?
No. I'm trying to. Anyway. But he. Yeah, I feel like he needs the camera. Like he wants to keep the camera. Like the opposite.
Eats? Did you say
keeps?
Oh,
Keeps.
I said keeps.
Like he wants the camera. Like the complete opposite. Like he uses it really. I was kind of banking on you knowing him.
I'm really sorry. People think I'm really up to date with cinema, but like last year I made.
You the story of film.
I know. Last year I made 4 feature-length films in 1 year. So really, that takes up quite a lot of time. So I really apologise that I'm not quite as up to date as I should be. I'm sorry about that.
When when you're in your 90s or something, you can watch it. I definitely, yeah. Thank you. And also, what's the name of that camera? The little tripod?
It's a Flip.
It's called a Flip.
Yeah, you no longer can get them, I don't think. But they're great. I love them.
Thanks so much.
Yes, it's a question at the back, and I'll come down to the front.
We need. I was going to say just shout, but we need it for the camera.
Yeah.
Hey, looking at the clips of your movies, I realize, like there is like a certain like imperfection or like, not imperfection, but what, like, sort of like you manage the camera like without being afraid of like making mistakes, not getting that, or like being shaky.
Yeah.
And all of these things that are sort of like taboo for many filmmakers, or at least in film school. So I was wondering, like, what is your relation to like this imperfection that comes with documentary?
A lot of my films actually are the camera doesn't move at all, because when I first started shooting films I didn't know how to move it, or I didn't have the equipment to move it, so it was as simple as that, and there were very rigorous frames. But I agree, the clips that we have here this evening there's a lot of shaky stuff, and it's that kind of feeling of the person behind the camera. You feel it in writers as well. I always say that Virginia Woolf was a great film editor or a great writer, and you can feel that tremulous uncertainty in her best work. The sentence itself is full of subclauses and doubts, and I just love that. And so I don't mind sometimes having shaky scenes in the film. Overall, there's a kind of rigor, there's a lack of movement in some of the films. There are these big long shots where there's no movement, but it's fine to have that sense that the camera isn't just an object, that kind of Cartesian, omniscient eye. I quite like the shake a little bit. It's, the way people like vinyl now rather than CDs or downloads. It's sort of the same thing. There's a kind of crackle there, which is humanizing, I think.
Okay, there was a hand sort of round about. Yes, yeah.
That sounds as if there was no body, just a hand.
It's just a hand.
Where's the hand?
Hang on, the slow process of the microphone.
Is it coming down? Yeah.
Please do pass the microphone.
It's coming.
Well, you should be filming this.
So I really enjoyed the first clip that was showing me the kids. Was that the first clip?
The second.
Yeah. And it got me thinking about time and youth and that kind of thing. And I was just wondering if you could give yourself a single piece of advice at the age of 21, what would that advice be and why?
It would be 2 words: aim high. It took me a long time to realize that I should aim high and not try to just wait until somebody gave me the green light. And I took quite a while, about 5 years of filmmaking before I thought, okay, I'm going to take on a really big subject. So I would say aim high. And there's another thing that, there's a quotation that I've quoted a lot, so any of you have heard me speak before, you probably heard me say this, but I just love it. It's from Robert Bresson, and he said, "Try to show that which without you might never have been seen." That which without you might never have been seen. In other words, what has not been on the screen before? Tarantino's been on the screen a lot, so don't do another Tarantino. Tarkovsky's been on the screen a lot, so don't do another Tarkovsky. Scorsese's been on the screen. Don't do full versions of these people. What sort of life or what sort of content, what sort of style has not been on the screen before? So I think that's good advice. But 2 words in that sentence that are really useful: try to show that which without you might never have been seen. So there are 2 sort of humbling qualifiers there, so you don't have to do David Lynch's Inland Empire all in one go, which was definitely not on the screen before. But try.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. One last question over here.
I think everybody's been struck by your positivity, but as a filmmaker and a person, what frustrates you, angers you, or upsets you, and how do you overcome these hurdles?
Did you say as a filmmaker and as a person?
I couldn't decide whether filmmaking would be fraught with more difficulties or as a person. Upset stems from, say, some of the places that you've been or stories that you've told. So
that's a tricky question. As a filmmaker, I remember when, the pilgrimage thing that Danny mentioned earlier, where Tilda Swinton and I pulled a cinema across Scotland. I remember after I went to people, it was amazing how many people listed the reasons why that would be difficult. As if I hadn't thought about that. It hadn't occurred to me that that could be dangerous, or the truck would be heavy, or it might rain, or there might be midges, or it does frustrate me when, if you have an idea, quite a lot of people think you haven't considered the problems, but you have considered the problems, but simply what you've done is leapt over the problems and said we can get over those things, if you've got a strong enough idea. So in sort of project filmmaking terms, that's frustrating. In private terms, to be really honest, the biggest frustration or challenge to me is my own shyness or nervousness about doing something like this. When you're a filmmaker, you have to do public speaking and introduce films. Somebody like Danny makes it extremely easy, but overall, I am petrified at doing things like this, and so I use huge amount of nervous energy and adrenaline just to get to the point, and a wee bit of white wine as well, to get to the point where I can sit on stage and seem relaxed. And so that's a real frustration. If there was a switch in my head that I could simply switch off to reduce those anxieties, it would make my life a lot easier. That's quite a personal answer. But so that's the first bit of the answer was more interesting, obviously.
How strange an experience has this been? Because it must have, I worried it must feel like having your life flash before your eyes, and sort of standing there at the celestial gates.
I remember, this Scene by Scene program, I used to do a similar format to this, and I remember saying to Paul Schrader, what's it like watching the clips of your films? And he came out with the beautiful positive line, it's a lose-lose proposition. By which he said, either you look at the clips and you thought, my God, I was so talented, where did that talent go? Or you think, oh my God, I never had talent in the first place. In this case, it's weird, the present tenseness of film, that idea that it's light from a distant star. The star might be dead, but the light's still traveling, means that when I see the neo-Nazi scene, I'm still scared. And when I see the kids against the wall and him talking about the dog and the dog and donkey, I still laugh. And so it still has the ability to make me laugh, even though lots of people have said to me, as a filmmaker, now that you're a filmmaker, you must no longer just to sit in the front row and enjoy films. You must be looking at how they're made. Not at all. I still watch in a quite childlike way, and the emotions come from the screen, like vitamin D comes from the screen. It doesn't come from the screen, but it comes from the sun. It should come from the screen. If they could pump it from the screen, then that would be even better. It wouldn't need to go on hold. So that kind of quite unguarded response to what happens, even though these are clips that I was obviously involved with, it's just as direct as ever for me.
We'll have to leave it there, sadly, but please join me in thanking the one and only